welcome everybody. This meeting is being recorded. And the purpose of today's meeting is really to think about how can we get started on water in procurement. So this will be very much tailored to sort of procurement folk. But don't worry if you don't sit in procurement, because if you are sort of starting out on water, a lot of what Scott's going to cover will be equally important as well. So I think this will be a great session. And what we'll also end the session on is having sort of a brief discussion about how we can start to engage suppliers as well. So Scott, next slide, please.
Sure.
So in short, this wonderful presentation has been brought to you by the Sustainable Procurement Pledges Nature and Biodiversity chapter, which tries to cover all nature's wonderful topics, of which water is one. For those that don't know the Sustainable Procurement Pledge, they're really an NGO on a mission to ensure sustainable procurement becomes the default and to really start empowering procurement professionals to drive sustainable change in the workplace. And the basis of the Nature and Biodiversity chapter is really just to demystify nature so that procurement feel more inclined to get involved and start really including nature in some of their buying decisions so that they can buy better. And so today's session will include Scott Oram, who's the global water lead from Haleon, and I'll let Scott sort of introduce himself when he starts his bit. And myself, I'll do the sort of encore bits at the end. And I'm currently running the Hidden Heroes campaign. But for those that have heard of me before, I used to sort of sit in the life sciences space, as well as Scott, sort of heading up the global sustainability function at a Fortune 500 company, which I've now left. And just for some housekeeping rules, guys, if you can all go on mute, because we can hear some people's speakers there and catching background noise. So please stay on mute until you want to ask a question. If you don't want to interrupt us, you're welcome to put a question in the Q&A function, and we'll see if we can get through to those by the end of the session. But we also want this to be a very open, fun, engaging session. So if you do have a question which is pertinent to what Scott or I are covering, please do just jump in and interrupt us, because we'd rather answer it as we're going through. I'm not sure if the language translation function is available. I will be honest there, but if it is, we will certainly make it available, and we will share this content afterwards. And it is being recorded as well, so just be aware of that too. And so the agenda for today, which will mainly be done by Scott, if I'm honest, will cover an introduction into water, thinking about aims and objectives. Scott will then sort of take you through water stewardship in detail and kind of set the scene as to what that means, and then start to look at what approaches you can take, focusing on sort of the maturity level that you might find yourself in, and therefore the type of approach that you might take depending on that maturity level. You'll then cover the business case for water, which I think is really important for selling this into your companies. And then if we have time, I will like to go through the Encore tool, which is a great tool for procurement professionals to use before even engaging with their sustainability folks, just to start understanding what are the risks and impacts associated with water, so you can put those into your category strategies. And then we'll kind of finish off the session having more of an open discussion based on everything that we've covered. What would that mean in relation to engaging with suppliers and how you can engage with them going forward? And then obviously additional Q&A at the end. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Scott, who can obviously introduce himself a lot better since he's been covering water for ages and is brilliant in this topic. And I'll hand over to you, Scott.
Cool. Thank you, Emma. Great. Thanks for having me, Emma, first and foremost. And interesting and engaging session. Now that's putting pressure on me, right? So I'm going to try and live up to that a little bit. I'm Scott. I work in the central sustainability team at Haleon, and I'm the global water lead. So I admit now I'm not in procurement, and I regularly have conversations with my procurement colleagues, and they regularly feed back to me what I'm doing well, what I'm not doing so well, and what suppliers really think about. So hopefully I've got a grip a little bit on the content of today and exactly how we might look at suppliers and how we might engage with them. I do prefer to keep it a bit of a dialogue. So if you do have questions, like Emma said, chuck them in the chat, or feel free to come off mute or do whatever you need to do to ask the question. Anything burning, ask during, and chuck it in the chat. And Emma, hopefully we can pick those up between us and answer them as we go. Cool. So what are we going to try and do today? So a bit of a 101 on the topic of water and why it's important, but I won't spend too much time on that. Outline best approaches, different levels of approaches we can take based on maturity with our suppliers. A bit of support on the business case. You know, that is a commonly asked question. How do we make the business case on water? I'll share a few common questions with you and how I answer them, which will hopefully get you in a better position to make that business case with your own organization. And then I'll hand over to Emma to talk a little bit about procurement categories where water risks are more salient, and a little demonstration of Encore if we have time. So, why care about water? Simple question, complex answer. But I think for me personally, and for the company that I work for, it's very closely linked to human health. Access to good, clean water improves community health and reduces disease. Very connected to what I care about. So that's at a personal level. Maintains ecosystems, planetary health, biodiversity, something else that is very important for the human race and our survival. And then business, perhaps a little bit more grey, a little more hard and stern, but we need it, right, to make our product, supply, source our product, and to turn it into something useful for us. Whether we make consumer products, whether we make clothes, whether we make beer, whatever we do, we need water in our product, or we need it in some way to make our product. And when water isn't managed correctly, things like water scarcity, poor water quality, pollution, or lack of access poses risks to our business and our communities where we live, and our health as well. So it's important that we invest in this space, both for our community, ourselves, and our business as well. So just a bit of basics, roll back a little bit. But unlike carbon, you can kind of think of water in three ways. So carbon, a ton of carbon is a ton of carbon, no matter where you are in the world. A meter cubed of water, a litre of water, a gallon of water, wherever you are, is not the same in, say, China as it is in the UK, as it is in South America somewhere, or South Africa. And that's because it's all context-based. So a meter cubed of good, clean water is more valuable in places where you have scarcity. So if you think of water in three ways, one is availability. So is there enough of it to do what you need to do to service the business, and there's still enough for the ecosystem around you and for the communities around you as well? Too much water, flood, too little, drought, both are not great for any of those elements of society, business, community, or ecosystems that we depend on. The bottom element is quality. You need good quality water to make your product, or to clean down your machinery and kit when you're making your product, or you might need it very sort of integrally if you're doing something like, or have suppliers who based in agriculture, think growing of mint or wheat or whatever you might need to source from those places. You need good quality water. And the second is you impact on water quality as well. Through the processes, you use that water, bring it into your supplier, we use that water, bring it in, use it for crops or for manufacture, and they'll change that water in some way, usually adding pollutants. They might treat some of those pollutants, but then they'll return it back to the receiving environment. So very important we consider quality. And the last and probably most overlooked is access. Water is a human right. Access to good, clean water is a human right, and should be considered as such in our supply chains. So communities where we operate, sites we source from, you need to be very sure that there is access to good quality clean water in line with local regulations, and sanitation as well, so toilets where people can access. So there's these three dimensions, and that's important because they're going to be key in how you approach the risk, understand it, and the implementation of any mitigation strategies as well. So what kind of risks do you face, could you face, may you face when considering water? I think the first is I touched on, kind of said it purposely a few times, community. The water that you use on your site is not isolated. You share that water with a local community. And your license to operate in an area is often dictated by the community you share it with, whether that's politically or socially. If people don't want you around, it's going to make it very hard for your supplier or yourselves to do business. So recognizing the shared resource is really important. A big part of that is media recognition. So there is quite a lot of news in the media on water at the moment about things like data centers or other things, whether or not they use a lot of water or not. I'm not here to debate that, but you can see it's in the media. And pollution is in the media quite a lot as well, water pollution. So questions to be asked around what would significant media attention on water with one of your suppliers or your own company, how would that impact you? Investors are often interested as well. They're interested because, like I said, availability of good quality water to make your product, source your ingredients, whatever you need to do, will impact your business. If there are interruptions to supply because there's not enough water or water restrictions or flood, that's going to impact your bottom line. And we call it resilience, right? Your maintenance of supply, security of supply to do what you need to do. But investors are obviously interested if you're able to make your product, get it to the right place at the right time. And they're interested because they know climate change and mismanaged water resources can impact your ability to do that. So very important. They're another focus group. And then last is regulators. Regulators tend to step in if they believe something's being mismanaged or perhaps not complied with, right? So there is an element where regulators will step in if they believe that local water resources are not being managed to a greater or lesser level. So if you think of somewhere where there are severe water shortages, I'm going to say South Africa, when there was water shortages and they had their day zero where they nearly ran out of water in 2017-18, the water regulator put in restrictions. So reduce water use by 20%, 50%, or you're not using water at all because you are not considered integral. So how would that impact your business? A reduction in water like that impact your business, or being denied access to water? And do you want to be in that position? So there's lots of risks here from lots of different places. So it's the case I'm making is this is something you need to pay attention to, in effect, in short. So what can you do about it? And how might you approach your suppliers when you're considering water, considering it's multidimensional, considering it can have such a large impact on your business? Well, I think to break it down, there's a simple maturity level, and this is how I approach my supplier base on this within Haleon. We break it down into 3 kind of levels of maturity, and you'll often find that there is a big 80% at 1 and 2, and then there's a select few who are at maturity level 3. 3 being best practice, 1 being compliance, if you think about it quite simply. So I'll go through each of them in turn, spending more and more time as we go from left to right, because 1's pretty simple. 3 is where the meat is and what we could really do with delving into a bit more. But if we look at 1, so what should at a basic level we be looking for? Compliance is a nice, easy number 1. So compliance at 2 points, probably 3 points. 1 is water withdrawal. If your supplier has abstraction from groundwater or abstraction from surface water, local rivers, do they have the right permits in place to legally withdraw that water? That's really important. And illegal abstraction is something which happens a lot. I'm not saying necessarily within your supply chain, but does happen a lot and can really destabilize the water resources in any given area. So that's the first thing to check. Next thing to check is wastewater discharge permits as well. So do they have a license to discharge to the local municipality? Do they have a wastewater treatment plant on site where they can discharge treated wastewater to a river? Is that in place? Again, if you don't have either of those, the supplier's business can be pretty quickly stopped should a regulator intervene, right? And if a supplier, the business is stopped, what does that do to your supply? So pretty quick one to check. I imagine most people have basic compliance checks in place with your environment, health and safety team. So definitely worth checking in there to make sure everything's in place. Probably when you onboarded the supplier, this would have been checked. And then at a very small level, you can look at setting efficiency goals and reviewing performance with your supplier as a matter of your normal supplier performance review meetings. So that's at kind of a really basic level. what we could all do and have that first kind of conversation with the supplier. We then looked a bit, what does a bit more mature look like? Further on that maturity scale, what does that look like? I think the first thing you probably look to a supplier to do is to develop this understanding of water risk. So I mentioned these three elements of water, so availability, quality, and then access to clean water and sanitation in the communities. There are a number of tools you can put in, you can utilize to understand that level of risk, depending on the commodity you source or the supplier location. And Emma will talk a bit later about the commodity you source and the kind of water dependencies and impacts associated with that. I'll talk to you a little bit about location in just a second. But that is a really good place to start. At a high level, using some of the tools that are available to us for free, is there risk associated with that supplier, the commodity source or the location where they are manufacturing or sourcing that? The next thing to do is to track that risk and look at what implementation, what measures they implement to mitigate some of those risks. So if it's an availability risk in that particular location, what action are they taking? Do they have a business continuity plan so that should the regulator turn around and say, right, you need to reduce your water by 20% in the next 3 months, do they have a plan in place to do that? If their groundwater supply were to dry up because of illegal abstraction locally, meant that more water was taken out of the groundwater than could sustain, have they got an alternative water supply? So have they got a supplier who is based, in the next valley over where there is enough water that they can tanker in and keep it going? So we're talking about the basic understanding of the risks and then kind of the more straightforward business continuity planning around it. Now, I said I'd talk to you about location, and then we'll talk to you about commodity when you're looking at impacts and dependencies of these water-related risks. A really simple thing you can do, or you can talk to your sustainability teams about doing for you, should you have a good relationship with your sustainability team, which I'm sure you do. You can look at your locations of your suppliers, or your contract manufacturing organizations, or even your own sites if you haven't done this before. You put in the latitudes and longitudes of each of your sites, which you can get through simple postcode to lat long. If you Google postcode to lat long, you can find where most of your suppliers will be based on their addresses. Make sure you look at manufacturing address rather than head office address. Type those in, and then a number of parameters are used, different risk data is used to determine your risk, between 1 and 5 usually, whether there's a risk of flood, a risk of drought, quality issues locally, access to clean water and sanitation issues locally. And you'll get a kind of a plots on a map, and you'll get a risk factor associated with them. Usually the higher the number, the greater the risk factor. What this enables you to do is to kind of figure out, okay, of your supply base, who is at high risk, put that first lens over there, and then you probably want to add a second lens over of who is material to my business. So sometimes we look at a spend limit, a minimum spend crossed over with environmental risk, and that gives us a nice, neat list of suppliers that I want to engage with because there is a high risk of one of these things happening, of a flood, availability issue or drought issue, and we spend quite a lot of money with them, or we're reliant on them for a particular commodity that isn't, that we need for our business. This is a really good first start, and I would be surprised if you contacted, 100 suppliers, probably 10 suppliers, 15 suppliers have done this already, and figured out particularly ones with commodities who are more vulnerable. So anything with an agricultural sourcing, anything that requires a lot of water, probably have already done this exercise because they know it's really important to their business. And that's a good place to start when you engage with a supplier, is asking, what have you done on water? And have you done these types of exercises? And the answer can be yes. In the minority of cases, but can be yes. So that's location. And location is important because, like I said in the beginning, a meter cubed of water is not the same in China as it is in the UK, as it is in South Africa, as it is in Brazil. Each of these have context-based issues. So they have local issues which influence some of the risk associated with this. Generally, where you have water availability, so not enough, meter cubed of water is a lot more valuable than, say, a place where you have a lot of water, parts of Canada, parts of Scotland, although you can't say that anymore because actually changing weather patterns mean there are a lot of places which are suffering from drought due to climate change. That's kind of medium maturity. So just going back to that, it's beyond simple stuff like basic water monitoring, setting up sufficient goals. It really is about understanding the risk associated with water to your business, either from location or the commodities that you use. And it's really important because when you're making the business case a bit later, it's hard to do unless you have this information to hand. And it's also going to be hard to influence suppliers or your own company to take action with suppliers unless you do some of this work up front and really accurately describe the risk and the impact it's going to have to your business. So I said there'd be a bit more detail as we go along. This is what I would consider probably, well, according to Scott, but probably quite mature in this space. If you looked at a supplier and they had some third-party standards they were adhering to on water, if they developed water action plans at the sites beyond business continuity plans, if they'd started to partake in some local community project or nature-based solution type initiatives, started reusing water on site, or even incorporating water considerations in their R&D process, so in the products that they give to you, products that they supply you. I'm sure they're not going to give you anything. Suppliers, products that they supply to you or services that they provide to you that reduce their demand on water. So this is really the higher end, and there's probably a smaller percentage of suppliers who are in this space. And again, it's going to be those who are really exposed to water-related risks, probably agricultural-based or high water users, things like paper mills, things like that, where there is a high water use. What does this look like? So I mentioned credible third-party standards that they could adhere to. What are those? One of them is the Alliance Water Stewardship Standard. Bit of information about it on screen. In short, it's a globally applicable framework with 5 steps that really focuses on the sustainable and equitable use of water that is beneficial economically as well as to the communities around you. And what it involves is looking at water on site, so your typical efficiency, reuse, business continuity planning metrics on site. Plus, it involves looking outwards towards your catchment, the local area of land on which you operate and the communities which you operate in, and looking at your water sources, your water discharges, what your dependencies are there, what your impacts are there. So it requires you to look a bit further out of your factory gates at the water resources you share with the local ecosystem and local community. Just to kind of illustrate that point, what is a basin? Basin is a watershed, is a catchment, depending on how you like to describe it. Effectively, it's a parcel of land of which water will drain from the sides into the middle. Usually there's a lake in the middle, river, whatever else it might be. But your site or your supplier site will be one dot within this catchment, within this basin. And you're dependent on water resources that are probably used by or impacted by a lot of people upstream. So if you think where industry is and suppliers usually are, some kind of semi-built up urban-ish area, unless they're providing agricultural commodities, which are going to be further upstream. Upstream of a lot of these places is agriculture, is farming, and there's sedimentation issues. If you imagine runoff from biocides, pesticides from these type of agricultural places, and then we've got to use that water for drinking water and to power our sites and manufacture. So we are dependent on this resource which other people impact. So if you think about that relationship, in order to solve for upstream pollution, you're going to need to talk to those polluters. And that's what this is all about, really. It's about recognizing water as a shared resource within a local area and the need to go out the factory gates and engage with the people that manage or impact this water resource to be able to better address the risks that you face. So if you're thinking about it another way, your supplier is perfect at using water on site or your manufacturing location. You reuse, you reduce, you recycle water, use it really efficiently. All that is great. But if everyone else isn't doing that, if everyone else is withdrawing illegally, there's not going to be any water, no matter how little water you use. If everyone else is using it frivolously and illegally, that's going to impact you. If people are upstream polluting, doesn't matter that you've reduced your water use by 50%. If that 50% you rely upon is heavily polluted, that's going to cost you or the supplier a lot of money to clean up, to be able to use. And it might, that might go into cost of goods. That might go into business interruption. So you can see how these kind of things affect you. Just to kind of outline what it might look like. If you're up that maturity scale, you're looking at these external standards that you might be adhering to, this idea of stewardship. You're going from this traditional internal focus of control, compliance, conservation, and you're looking externally. You're looking really at your source of water. What is the resiliency of that water to climate change or increased population, whatever those risks might be locally, impacting availability? And what does that mean in terms of risk to your business? What is the regulator's position on water? What's their 5-year plan on water, 10-year plan on water? Do they expect to have population increases, which might put stresses on the water resources? Do they have enough capacity to meet those extra stresses? And it's really proactive. So you're looking externally, but you're also looking to the future and making a plan to ensure that the business or the supplier business is resilient to some of those changes that might come in the future and adapts to get there, right? That's really important. So what does it look like? Because that is really, nebulous, right? How do you engage with people externally? And what are the kind of conversations you have? What are the kind of initiatives that you can invest in? Well, within Haleon, we have looked at this and tried to understand some of this. So this is an example of one of our manufacturing sites in Cape Town, South Africa. One of the new sites is an example I like to rely on, but we do more than this. There is a site which produces Grandpa. It's a paracetamol-based regional brand in South Africa, very popular. And 2017, like I mentioned before, there was a day zero where the city of Cape Town within South Africa very nearly ran out of water. And there were standpipes, people had to go to those, lots of regulatory restrictions on water use. Everyone was scrabbling to find second or third sources of water to keep their family going, let alone businesses, right? We recognized this at the time, and since then have really looked more widely at the catchment, so where our water sources come from. They all come from dams and reservoirs up in the mountains, up in the Table Mountains. A little picture on the bottom left-hand corner of one of the reservoirs where it comes from. And we found that one of the things affecting the availability of water in those areas where there was ecosystem degradation, basically. So lots of invasive non-native species of plants had taken over these upper uplands and were quite thirsty. So they were drawing a lot of the rainwater off, which meant less rainwater went to the reservoirs, which means less water went down to Cape Town. And one of the things we invested in, recognizing this with WWF, is restoring the natural landscape with native plants who are less water intensive, working with farmers to restore land to reduce runoff, working with local businesses to grow plants, native plants, to go and restore these landscapes. Because we knew that these reservoirs were key to sourcing town of Cape Town, where we manufacture our products, and the root cause of some of that was these invasive non-native species. So we invested in a project to restore the landscape, increase the water availability, and then hopefully in turn increase the resilience overall of that catchment. So just an example of what we did, and it feels quite distant, right? Like restoring nature up in the uplands of South Africa. But actually, there's a very clear business case that by doing that, we help catalyze action in an area where action is needed to increase security of supply. So it's not just us doing it. We work with WWF, and there are a number of other companies who also fund the same project. So you're getting impact at scale. So before I've got a couple more slides before I hand over to Emma, but you don't have to do any of this on your own, I think is another really important part of the puzzle here. I mentioned just then, collective impact is important. You're going to need not just yourself investing and looking into this, or your suppliers, but others in a local area to invest to solve for some of these issues, because they are bigger than any one site in any one area. If you get to a point where you think water is a material risk in your supply chain, depending on location or commodity, connect with your sustainability teams first and foremost. Don't do any of this on your own, but there are plenty of organizations external. These might be sector-specific organizations, or they could be sector agnostic. So sector-specific organizations might look at a particular problem within your sector. So say for textiles, where water pollution in making the garments is a particular problem, there's something called the Zero Discharge of Hazardous Chemicals community, where they set standards of working with supply chains to phase out certain substances from your supply chain and also treat wastewater. That's very specific to textiles. There are some agnostic initiatives as well, sector agnostic initiatives like the Alliance Water Stewardship, which I mentioned before. Anyone can join those, or the Water Resilience Coalition or CEO Water Mandate. These are big groups which focus on water risk and support companies in implementing some action to protect themselves from these risks. And they're quite proactive as well. Again, this is all on the higher level end of maturity, where you might just focus on very few suppliers, engaging them on things like this, or even your own sites where there really is a material risk. On that basis, you're going to need a business case, which is always the hardest part. Well, sometimes the hardest part. You can certainly get the most challenging questions, which I put some of them on the screen now. This is what I hear all the time, by the way. And I'm going to kind of answer some of these as we go. Now, I can't answer and help you make the business case for your specific suppliers or your specific strategic intervention that you might want to do with your suppliers, but these are a couple of questions which might help. So the first is, water is cheap, why should I invest in efficiency? Well, water is cheap, right? It's sometimes less than a cent a meter cubed. But if you think about the true cost of water, quite often with water, you use energy to heat it, to move it, and to treat that water. That all costs you money because you're having to invest in energy costs. Treatment costs, you're going to have to use chemicals to make that water suitable for what you want it to do. Maybe you're going to have to clean it up. That's will cost energy, or there might be a chemical cost associated with that. All of these also have a carbon cost. And given the backdrop of water availability with climate change, with moving populations, scarcity, we see a lot in a lot of different regions. Sometimes climate change, sometimes it could just be population or disputes between borders of countries, which we're seeing more and more, where they share things like rivers, where rivers pass through several countries. All that leads to uncertainty, which can lead to rising costs of your ordinary municipal supplied bill. We've seen that a lot across where I work, a lot of increasing costs there. So your OPEX is going up with your suppliers. That might be passed on cost of goods. And then if you're really in a pickle, if you find some of your suppliers or your own sites have to tanker in water or bring it in, that is incredibly expensive to do. So if they've got a business continuity plan to say, if we run out of water, we'll tanker it in. It's an incredible amount of money to bring in. So that's the first thing, true cost of water. It's cheap. Why should I invest in efficiency? Well, probably not as cheap as you think it is. It's probably costing your company a lot more in OPEX than you think it is. The next question, there are never any problems with water availability in the past. Why should it be an issue in the future? You always get a weathered engineer telling you that some of these manufacturing sites or supply sites, the last 25 years, we've never had a problem, and we won't have a problem in the future. I've heard those words many times, and they've also come to bite them. Because there can be an issue. The past is not a good predictor in the future right now, given the uncertainty that we live in with climate change, movement of people, etc. So a couple of questions I ask straight away, and I ask our suppliers, do you know your source of water? The answer will be yes, it's from the government or it's from X company. Where do they get their water from? Do you really know where your water comes from? It doesn't come out of a tap or through a pipe. It comes from a reservoir somewhere or a river, or it comes from groundwater. Do you know how secure that source is? Have you ever inquired about the levels? We go into drought most summers in the UK. Sometimes we get a hose pipe ban, sometimes we don't. But have we inquired exactly what the plan is for water security for the next 10 years and how that's going to be provided and what are the risks associated with that? And the regulators and the providers might be very honest with you or with your supplier. And how does it change over time? You know, I mentioned 10-year horizon is probably, if it's still quite short in terms of water, but if they have something in place, sometimes they can have 50-year plans. What are they expecting and how will that affect supply? Are they expecting to be able to cater to the supply required? And then why do I need to look outside the factory gates? If I do water well inside the factory gates, why do I need to bother? Well, you share a resource with the communities around you. Your license to operate in that area is determined by the communities around you. And if there's water challenges, serious ones with drought or quality, do you want to be seen or your supply chain to be seen as part of the problem or part of a solution with those? And how could some media coverage impact your business if it went wrong and you were seen part of the problem? So all of this you can combine with your risk and your materiality to really build that business case. And these are just a few pointers. Now, I think at this point, I hand over to you, Emma, I believe.
Thanks, Scott. So we could probably go to the next slide. Brilliant, folks. So I've just realized we probably haven't done this in the best sequential order, because in a weird way, you might actually want to actually look at which industries are impacted and dependent on water before you start any of this. But to ensure that Scott got the most time, we thought it was good to do it in this order. So the reasons for sort of going through this really is hopefully if you sit in procurement today, or are sat here wondering if this is even a relevant presentation to actually show your procurement teams, I think this is a really nice way to get started, even if you haven't engaged with your sustainability teams yet and just want to understand what are the impacts and risks associated with water that you can immediately start to understand and incorporate into your category strategies in short, and start thinking of it from a procurement perspective alone before engaging your sustainability teams. So there are various tools out there, and Scott touched on the WWF risk filter and the WRI aqueduct tool that actually focus very much on location. So this is when you already know that you have water as an impact and you now want to sort of filter down on location. So for those of you that don't even know that water is an impact or dependency, or potentially your oh no, just stay on that slide, don't worry Scott, I'll take over from you, or your sustainability team has perhaps just stated that water is going to be critical for you, and as a procurement person you want to understand, well, is it critical to my category? I think this is a good approach to follow. So I'm going to now share my screen, and hopefully Scott will tell me when you can all see it.
Coming through.
Excellent.
Yeah, we can see your screen.
Perfect. So a really good way to understand, does water matter to me in procurement, and how can I assess that against my various category and sort of commodity codes, is looking at a tool called Encore, which stands for Exploring Natural Capital Opportunities, Risks and Exposure. Now, the wonderful thing about Encore is it looks at a lot of your sustainability risks. So you can use it for more than water, but we will just focus on water today. For the purpose of it. And most people have a play by sort of, filling in this form immediately and saying what it spits out. But what I would probably suggest any procurement person does is they just go into data methodology, click here, go into methodology and downloads here, and then just download the outputs, because it's easier to work with their raw data and understand the methodology. So once you click download, and pure blue Peter fashion, you will get a big file like this with a data dump of all their stuff. And if you sit in procurement and you've never done this before, this is really quite overwhelming. So hopefully if you remember nothing and want to use Encore, remember this. The files that you basically need are 2, 4, 8 and 9 in short. you can pretty much ignore all the others unless you really want to get into it. But as a sort of cursory quick analysis, that's all you need. 2 will show you what are the definitions, your impact definitions, and 4 will show, sorry, I've done that wrong. Yes, and I think 4 will do your dependency definitions. I hope I've done that the right way round. Frustratingly, they often don't use the word impact and dependency, so you sometimes have to work it out. But if you want to know what a definition is, so what does water supply mean to me and why is that important to my company, it will give you the why and explanation in these 2 documents. You can then actually jump in here where you see, sorry, so I got that wrong. So this is your dependency. This is your impact in short, right? So for number 8, if you then want to know what are your dependencies, you would click here. And if you want to know what are your impacts, you would click number 9, which I have open already. So you get a document that sort of spits out the information like this in short. And what you will have here on the left are the various ISIC codes, which are really the industry codes and classifications for different industries. And the simplest way, if you're sitting in procurement, to understand this, these will be very comparable to the way that you categorize your spend and have various sort of commodity coding for your spend as well. So what you would want to do, and it would take you perhaps half a day to do first, is to align the relevant ISIC codes to your category codes, which will take you a little bit of time initially, but it means that if you ever want to run an analysis like this in the future, you can do it in seconds using a VLOOKUP. So you just need to tag your ISIC group codes with your own category codes. And then what this allows you then to do is to see across the board, looking at a lot of nature-based criteria, not just water, but we will focus on the water ones, whether you have high risk or low risk. So let's find a water one, which I've highlighted here. Okay, so water purification is a potential risk. And what you can do very quickly, without even fully understanding what's going on at this stage, is just click here and tag what you want to see. So VH stands for very high and H stands for high. So what you could do here is immediately go high and very high, okay, and then look at it. So what I've done here is I've just pulled up all the water ones and colored them in yellow for the purpose of this demonstration. And then what I've done is I've actually looked at which ones are very high and high across all these different criteria and just put yes if it's very high or high. And what that then allows me to do very quickly is by industry or category code, because you've done the linkage, is work out which of my categories potentially have a high water risk, or I should say impact or dependency. And the same applies to the other document in short. So this one looks at your impacts, if I'm getting this right. Same thing again, where I've just highlighted which ones are the water ones, if water is the only thing that I want to look at. And again, I've done the exact same thing. Here with impact, I might want to even baby it down a bit more and go, well, this is quite a complicated topic for me. And actually what would be really helpful just as a starter for 10 is just look at does the industry or does my category use a lot of water, and just start there and only look at this column. If you want to start really basic and sort of grow over time, that's another thing you can do. And you can see here that I've just done some basic pivots. If we go back to the presentation, Scott, now, and if you could share again.
Should be making its way on screen.
Great.
Just jump to the right slide for you.
Thank you. Oh, and if we can just go on to the next slide, that'd be great. So what I've done here is just to show you how easy this is I've just pulled together all the very high and high sort of water dependency industries and put them on here. And there's 69 of them. So if you were just looking at water as an area and you were very much focused on dependency, and often I say to people, dependency is a great way to look at it because this is where your business is dependent on water. So if something goes wrong, your business won't be able to operate. And they care about that because it costs money and it's actually a much easier business case to make. So all you would need to do is say, do any of my category codes or subcategory codes align with these industries? create the sort of VLOOKUP methodology, and then be able to start using that data to see where exactly do you have dependencies across water. If we just go on to the next one. Yep, and you can do the same again for impacts. And what I always say to people is, if you do have, let's say, impacts and dependencies, it often helps to frame it from a dependency route to your business, and just sort of put impacts as a secondary activity, not because it's less of a priority, just because you're likely to move your business faster and actually give it more importance if you focus on dependencies. And in essence, impacts can then piggyback onto that, in short, because if you have a high dependency, you do want to worry about your volume use, because if you do have high volume use and you have a high dependency, that in essence is likely going to cost your business money if something happens to your water source in any way. So if we go on to the next slide. So I did this for another presentation, but I thought it was quite helpful to show. And what I did is I did the same encore analysis that you've just sort of seen me ping through. I aligned all the different nature-based criteria of impact nature-based criteria and dependency nature-based criteria to our headline categories, which you can see here on the left, starting with chemicals, lab consumables, equipment, and instruments, as an example. And then the little wheel, what I did then is I actually added the spend where that impact or dependency had a very high criteria. And what that then allows me to do very quickly, and if we can go on to the next slide, is very quickly show where across all of nature, and not water specifically, do I have a lot of spend and where might I need to focus on. Now, what I've done, because this is a water session, is I've highlighted the water criteria, both in impacts and dependencies, in bold and green, so you can see the water ones. And if I just look at rainfall pattern regulation, that doesn't seem to be a big one in relation to spend. So it might not be one that I then focus on initially. But you can see as a business, this particular business, and it's actually quite representative of my last business, water flow regulation, water purification, and water supply are going to be big areas for us, and they're dependency areas, meaning that the business should care about this because it will cost money if we don't get it right. And what that then allows me to piggyback on are the impacts, like let's think about reducing our volume of water so that we're sort of minimizing our dependency, and let's actually look at the quality of our water as well, so that's supporting kind of dependency issues as well. So that's how you can hopefully use the encore analysis to start thinking as a category manager. I now know that water is going to be really important to my category. So for example, if I'm a chemicals category buyer, I know water is going to be really important to me. But then I also know from looking at this holistically, if you have a sustainable sourcing person that can help you with this, I then also know that it's not only important to my category, but it's likely going to be important to my entire function. And therefore, the sustainability team is likely going to have to engage with us all to actually take something forward on this, in short. So that kind of gives you an idea of how you can use the data and get started. Let's go on to the next session because I'm conscious of time, and that's kind of a bit more of a discussion. So we thought we'd have a quick discussion because there's so much to cover here. So how do you engage your suppliers on this? And I think there's two things you can do. I think if you're getting led by your sustainability team and they're pretty clear on the fact that they want you to focus on water, I think understanding the trajectory and things that you need to focus on that Scott went through are really important. And they will help you understand, is water going to be key to my suppliers in a specific location, because we've done the analysis, and they should then help you understand how you engage with the supplier. My argument here, and what I'm trying to get people to understand and do differently, is that that's very much a sort of retrospective way to engage with your suppliers, because your suppliers are already onboarded. Your sustainability team is likely putting pressure on you, and suddenly you have to sort of go, God, which locations are these suppliers sort of operating in, and do I have an issue, in short? I think if you start to use Encore as an example more strategically, before you even bring in your suppliers, you can factor that into your sourcing strategies. So before even having those suppliers onboarded, you can start to think, well, water is obviously a really key area for my category. I've already identified, because I've done some research, where suppliers are operating and where I have water stress or other water issues. Could I potentially change my sourcing strategy to maybe actually look at different areas where there's less of a risk? So this is before you've even contracted your supplier. Could you potentially think, well, we absolutely need to operate in this facility in Pakistan, which is water stressed, because they do the best price. We're not really going to be able to move things. So then you think, well, at point of tendering, can I actually put the cost of water, or this hidden cost of water, already in my tender, so that suppliers are actually pitching on the fact that we're already going to invest in this up front? And that way, when you come to look at your suppliers and you're engaging with your suppliers, as opposed to it being this kind of sideways requirement that's coming from your sustainability team, and they're already contracted and you have limited movement, you've already factored this into your sourcing cycle and sort of category strategy in the way you interact with them. So that's an ask that I would suggest all of you start to think about, and I think it will be helpful in the future for you to engage suppliers that way. I want to provide people with time for questions, so I am going to stop there, and I will look at the chat and Q&A, Scott, and I don't know if you have some questions.
I'll answer Joseph's sort of question. He said, when you say high water impact, is it basically an average that I can share with internal stakeholders? Sorry,
that was when
two questions.
That was when you were talking about Encore and how it actually provides you that information. At the top, the title was impact. And I wasn't sure, when we look at those industry codes, when it's just saying like severe or high, is that basically them kind of doing that, the legwork to say, hey, basically on an industry average, this is your use consumption for this specific category?
Do you want me to answer that, Scott?
Go ahead.
It's theoretical. So what it does is it tells you that your industry is likely to have that. However, to Scott's point, you may luckily be working with this great supplier that understands it's already an issue and they've already mitigated those risks, as an example. And so then you would then categorize your category as not being at risk. So I think there's different levels of, let's say, data analysis that you have to go through to understand how risky your category is and your supply base is. And as you go through those levels, recategorize it as your learning improves, in short.
Yeah, that makes sense, because another way would just be like, hey, I don't actually have the LCA data for water use consumption by product or whatever, but this is a way I can quickly tier out my risk based on where I'm at. So that makes sense. Thank you.
Yes.
And I would just, Emma and I, we get on because we disagree a lot. So the Encore and getting your kind of volume is one way of cutting the data first off, and it's brilliant. I think there may be cases based on location where you may be sourcing a commodity with a low volume of water, but because water is so scarce in some of those regions, that might still be an issue. So you just got to watch out for that. I think whichever way you cut, give yourself a bit of a way of backing up and just cross-checking the data to make sure that you've got those volume impact information and location somewhere, to just double check, for a few of your commodities or for your suppliers, so you don't miss key things.
And just to answer Picardo's question, it will be available on, so this presentation will be available, and it will be stored on the SPP site under the nature chapter, but you might have to wait sort of 2 weeks for us to get it loaded into YouTube and stuff and uploaded. But yeah.
Any other questions?
I do have another one if no one else does. Back to Scott. You had on your next steps for our suppliers page. You had track and manage water stress risk at facility or business unit level. I was curious if you could give any more insider information on what you think those should be, because that's something we're kind of looking at now with our company, is to say, if we eventually say these suppliers are high enough risk, we'd like to start tracking them. We don't want to waste their time. We don't want to ask for information that we're not going to do anything with. So we're trying to figure that out right now to say, if we do ask for our suppliers to report, what would that be? And so we're still kind of weighing that option out.
Yeah. That's, you're totally right as well. You don't want to over ask, because what are you going to do with that data anyway? And is it pertinent to the risk you're trying to manage? I would say, first off, in Haleon, we adopted a maturity level to allow a bit of freedom within that. So, but the key things were the conversations that we had. So where we thought the high risk and impact and dependency was, when we spoke to those suppliers, they tended to agree, and they tended to share with us how they were already mitigating that risk. So have I gone through and standardized the output of that? No, but I think it will probably boil down to a few things like business continuity plans in place, some kind of stewardship plans and risk mitigation plans, water security plans in place. It's probably how I would do it. But I'll be honest, I haven't boiled that down to a one KPI yet, and I am very conscious, like it sounds like you are, of not to put too much burden on a supplier at this point. So I'm in the conversation sort of phase at the moment, which is a bit of a cop-out answer, Joseph, but
yeah, I hear you.
It's where I am.
We thought about kind of selecting suppliers from all over the globe, if you will, and kind of just getting a listening session to say, what are you already tracking? What's already available?
Perfect.
So that's what we'll start with. But I was curious if there was anything there. But no, I appreciate it.
I'm only half a step ahead of you, but it sounds like you're going to catch up quick.
Maybe.
To add to that point, I do think there's something to be said about not asking, for example, for usage data at a supplier site, because it is really labor intensive to get people that information, and at the end of the day, you're not going to use it as a customer really. So I've certainly think asking about whether they have specific processes in place or even objectives or goals, as long as you're able to standardize those in some way, is a sort of better way for understanding whether they have the relevant mechanisms. That means that they are likely then tracking their water and doing something about it. But do consider your supplier. That's probably something I'd always advocate for. Perfect, folks. I think we're on the hour. If anyone's got any burning questions, Scott is on LinkedIn, but I will say Scott doesn't always answer quickly, so don't worry, he will come back to you, or you can send them to me and I'll send it to Scott because I will answer it faster. So thank